The night in Vermont was silent in a way that felt heavy, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your breath sound too loud. Snow fell in steady layers outside, coating the world in white, swallowing every noise. The old wooden cabin sat deep in the woods, more than 30 minutes away from town, surrounded by pine trees that moved like dark shadows when the wind cut through them. It was past midnight when I left my room to get some water. The hallway floor creaked under my socks. The air smelled like smoke from the dying fire and whiskey. I thought Kyle had passed out hours ago, but when I turned the corner, I saw him standing there in the kitchen blocking the doorway. The dull orange glow from the wood stove lit up the steel blade in his hand. It was the camping knife he had brought with him, sharp enough to skin fish. The way the light hit the blade made it look alive. His shirt was wrinkled, his breath smelled like alcohol, and his eyes, though half open, carried an unsettling focus. He tilted his head the way he always did when he wanted to remind me how small I was. His voice came out slow, clear, each word, like it was carved out of the cold air. If you disappeared, no one in this family would even notice. Not Mom, not Dad. No one. My body went rigid. His words did not crash into me like a shout. They cut like a quiet blade, sharp and precise. The knife gleamed as he turned it slightly between his fingers. I could hear the wind press against the walls. I could hear my own heart banging in my chest. My throat felt dry like the air had turned to sand. I did not speak. I did not even blink. My hand slid into the pocket of my jacket, and without looking down, I pressed the button on my phone to start recording. A tiny click, almost nothing. But to me, it sounded like the loudest thing in the world. He took a slow step toward me. His boots creaked on the floorboards. His mouth curled into a half smile, the kind that says this isn't a joke even if it sounds like one. He leaned in close, and the smell of whiskey hit me like a slap. His voice dropped lower, like a whisper made of glass. "And if you tell anyone, they'll believe me. Not you. You're just the background." That word background landed like a punch in my stomach. He did not need to explain. I knew exactly what he meant. He was the miracle child, the golden boy. I was the one who never really belonged. In the family's story, he was the headline, I was the footnote. The knife moved lazily in his hand as he stared at me almost like he was enjoying my silence. Behind me stretched the dark hallway. In front of me, he blocked the only way out. Beyond the kitchen window, there was nothing but black trees and falling snow. No signal. No neighbors. No one who could hear me if I screamed. My father used to say my silence was my only strength. I hated that, but standing there, I understood why. If I said a word, I might break. If I moved wrong, I might not get a second chance. He tilted his head again, the light catching his face just enough for me to see how calm he was. "See if something happened to you out here," he said softly. "Who would even look for you? Mom would cry for a day, maybe two. Dad would drink his scotch. Life would go on." The fire crackled weakly in the stove, the only sound between us. The cold from the window slid into the room like smoke, but inside me, everything burned. He lifted the blade a little closer, not pointing it at me directly, just enough for me to feel the weight of what he could do. The door behind him was locked. He had made sure of it earlier. I remembered the way he had checked it twice before we went to bed. I thought it was habit. It wasn't. I could not run. Not yet. But I could remember every second. He brushed his thumb along the flat of the blade like he was testing it. "So, sister," he whispered, dragging the word out like an insult. "Don't test me." My legs shook, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. The silence between us stretched like thin ice. One wrong move and it would shatter. He took another drink straight from the bottle, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and laughed under his breath. Then he stepped aside slowly, still holding the knife like he was letting me go, but reminding me I was never in control. I walked past him, careful not to turn my back too fast. I could feel his eyes following me all the way down the hallway. I locked my door behind me and leaned against it. My heartbeat filled the room. My phone was still recording. I whispered into the dark, "This isn't a joke." Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, I knew something had shifted. This was not a drunken threat. This was a warning, a promise, and I had just started recording my proof. What would you do if your own brother said that to you with a knife in his hand? When people talk about childhood, they talk about birthday candles, summer afternoons, and parents who make you feel like the world begins and ends with you. That was what it was like for me at first. I was adopted when I was 4. My parents could not have children back then, and when they brought me home, it felt like a storybook beginning. My mother brushed my hair every morning before school. My father carried me on his shoulders during fall festivals. They called me their miracle. They framed my first school drawing like it was priceless art. For 3 years, I was enough. And then everything changed. My mother got pregnant. 9 months later, Kyle was born. The moment he came home from the hospital, the air in the house shifted. I was 7 years old enough to see the difference, too young to fully understand it. I remember standing by the crib looking at the tiny baby wrapped in blue blankets, watching my mother's face glow in a way it never had for me. Pure love, unfiltered. My father's hands were gentle in ways they never were with me. I told myself it was just me being sensitive, but children notice the things adults think they hide. The first birthday after Kyle was born told me everything. For mine, there was a cupcake with a candle. For his, there were balloons, decorations, a big cake, relatives I had never even met. When I brought home my first spelling test with a gold star, my mom smiled quickly before turning to change Kyle's diaper. When Kyle managed to stack 3 toy blocks, they called my grandma and took pictures. The house began to fill with his laughter, his toys, his presents. Mine became background noise. I started to learn what it felt like to disappear while still standing in the same room. I tried to make myself useful. I helped with diapers. I learned to keep quiet. When he cried, my mom ran. When I cried, she said, "Sweetheart, you're stronger. You'll be fine." She said it like it was a good thing. It was not. Strength for me meant being alone. By the time I was 10, the pattern was set like concrete. Kyle got the new clothes, the decorated cakes, the praise for every small step. I got hand-me-downs from distant cousins and nods of approval that felt like background noise. When he got a B in school, they celebrated his effort. When I got straight A's, they told me not to get cocky. The words never hurt as much as the silence. That silence grew around me like walls. My father stopped reading me bedtime stories. My mother stopped asking me about school. It was not cruelty. It was worse. It was indifference. I was no longer the miracle. I was the warm-up act. I spent hours in my room listening to the sounds of their laughter from the living room, the sound of family that somehow did not include me. I told myself if I worked harder, they would notice again. So I did. I became the quiet child, the responsible one, the easy one. I helped around the house. I never asked for much. I got good grades. I kept my head down. I was useful, and being useful was the only thing that kept me tethered to them. I remember one night when I was 11 lying in bed and hearing my mother through the thin walls. She was talking to my father about the future. She said, "She's strong. She'll be fine." I lay there staring at the ceiling, understanding for the first time what that sentence meant. It meant I did not need their love. It meant they would not give it. It meant my value was measured in how little I needed. That night, something inside me hardened quietly and without ceremony. From that point on, I stopped expecting to be chosen. I stopped waiting for them to notice. I existed in the background of their story like a faded photograph on a crowded wall. Kyle's world got bigger. Mine got quieter. When he learned to ride a bike, they clapped and cheered and filmed it on their old camcorder. When I won a small science fair ribbon at school, I rode the bus home alone. I placed the ribbon on the kitchen table. My mother barely looked at it. My father asked if Kyle had eaten. That ribbon ended up in a drawer, wrinkled and forgotten. By 12, I understood my place in the family. I was the shadow. He was the sun. It was not said out loud. It never needed to be. It was written in every moment, every glance, every empty seat at the events that mattered to me. I told myself I did not need anyone. I told myself that silence was enough. I told myself I was strong. But strength that comes from being ignored does not feel like power. It feels like cold air in your lungs. It feels like standing outside a window watching everyone else sit at a warm table inside. That was my childhood. Not broken, not bruised, just quietly erased. The kind of erasure that seeps into your bones and whispers to you in the dark years later. And in that cabin, when Kyle whispered that no one would notice if I disappeared, it did not shock me. It was simply the echo of something I had known all along. As Kyle grew older, the gap between us stopped being invisible and became a living thing that moved through the house. He was the center of every conversation, every weekend plan, every family decision. If Kyle sneezed, it was news. If I achieved something, it was background noise. I learned to read the temperature of my parents' mood by how they reacted to him. When he stumbled, they rushed to catch him. When I stumbled, they told me to stand back up. They called him their little star. They called me responsible. That difference shaped everything. When he turned 16, he got a car with a giant red bow on it. My mother cried when they handed him the keys, as if this was the crowning moment of their parenting. I still remember the way he grinned holding the keys up like a trophy. I had watched him crash through life like someone walking on a soft rug. Everything caught him before he could fall. For me, there was no rug. There was only the floor. That same year, I was working part-time at a diner to save up for a used bus pass. I still remember the first time I stood at the bus stop in the rain, watching him drive by in that silver car while my parents sat in the passenger seats waving. They never came to my work. They never asked if I was cold or tired. They never asked anything. Kyle was the boy they had always wanted, the miracle son who could do no wrong. He could skip homework, mouth off to teachers, sneak out, and they would say, "He's just finding his way." If I so much as came home 5 minutes late, my father would lecture me about responsibility. If Kyle got a B, they called it progress. If I got an A, they reminded me not to brag. He got summer camps. I got grocery lists. He got praise for breathing. I got silence for surviving. He wore designer jackets. I wore clearance racks and secondhand shoes from distant cousins. When he forgot chores, someone else covered for him. When I forgot, they said I was slipping. He drank underage, once got caught, and they hired a lawyer without a second thought. When I forgot to pay my phone bill, they said maybe I needed to grow up. It was not the big things that hurt the most. It was the daily, ordinary ways they reminded me he mattered more. He was the golden boy. I was the scapegoat. Every family has one. Ours just did not bother hiding it. When something went wrong in the house, my name came up first. When the basement flooded because Kyle left the outside faucet running, my father said, "Why didn't you check it?" When Kyle lost his jacket at a party, my mother told me I should have reminded him to take care of his things. When the electric bill was higher than expected, they asked about my lights, not the game console he left on all night. They wrapped him in excuses and wrapped me in blame. I learned to keep receipts for everything. I learned to anticipate their accusations before they came. My teenage years felt like living in a house that I was constantly apologizing for just existing in. By the time Kyle graduated from high school, his failures were dressed up like triumphs. He barely passed his classes, but they threw him a backyard party with lights and a banner that said, "Congratulations, Kyle." Relatives gathered to praise him for his charm, his smile, his bright future. I graduated 2 years earlier with honors and got a pat on the back and a small card with $50 inside. No party, no lights, no banner. I stood in the kitchen that night listening to the music from his celebration echo across the lawn, and something cold settled deeper in my chest. It was the understanding that no matter what I achieved, I would always be the shadow standing behind him. When I went to college, I worked 3 jobs to pay tuition while Kyle partied through his freshman year with my parents covering everything. I ate instant noodles to stretch my budget while he went on spring break trips to Miami. They called him their fun-loving boy. They called me capable. It sounded like a compliment, but it was not. Capable meant they could ignore me. Capable meant I did not need love. Capable meant my value was measured by how little I cost them. I remember one Thanksgiving during my sophomore year. I came home exhausted juggling exams and work. Kyle had failed 2 classes but was still the one they toasted at dinner. "We're proud of you," my mother said to him as she passed the mashed potatoes. "You're doing your best." Then she turned to me and said, "And we're proud of you too, sweetie, for keeping it together." It was a single sentence, but the weight of it sat on my chest for years. Proud of him for existing. Proud of me for holding everything up. Kyle always had someone to catch him. I was expected to be the one doing the catching. When he moved back home after dropping out of college, they called it a transition period. When I asked for help with rent during my unpaid internship, they told me I was old enough to take care of myself. He brought home trouble. I brought home stability. But only one of us was loved out loud. Kyle was the golden boy wrapped in soft light and unconditional belief. I was the scapegoat holding a world that never once held me back. That imbalance was not just emotional. It became financial, physical, and inescapable. Every unfair moment was a drop in a glass that would one day overflow. And standing in that cabin years later with his knife catching the orange glow of the stove, I realized I had carried this weight my entire life. He was not wrong when he said no one would notice if I disappeared. He had been proving it to me since we were children. The thing about becoming the responsible one in a family like mine is that the line between being trusted and being used slowly disappears. It does not happen overnight. It happens in small steps that feel reasonable until one day you look up and realize you are carrying everything. After college, I got a job as an accountant at a small firm in Burlington. I worked long hours, stayed late, earned every dollar I had. It felt good at first. My life was finally mine, or so I thought. But responsibilities have a way of finding people who have proven they can handle them. It started small. A call from my mom about the electric bill being higher that month. A few extra dollars just until payday. Then the water bill. Then the mortgage payment was tight. I told myself it was family. Family helps family. That is what they always said. What I did not see then was that help was always a one-way street. Kyle still lived at home, jobless, drifting from one vague plan to another. My parents covered everything for him. I covered everything else. They said I was their strong one. They said I was so independent. They said Kyle was struggling and needed time. What they really meant was I would clean up the mess while he lived in it. I started paying the mortgage when my father was between jobs. Then I covered the insurance premium when they fell behind. Then groceries. Then repairs. By the time I was 26, more of my paycheck went to their household than to my own savings. I barely noticed at first because they wrapped every request in soft words. "You're just so reliable," my mother would say. "We're so proud of how you've built your life." I thought that was love. It wasn't. It was a transaction I did not know I had signed. Kyle never thanked me. He never even acknowledged it. If the lights stayed on, it was because the universe was generous, not because I had paid for it. When he bought a new gaming console, my parents smiled and called it a treat to cheer him up. I was the one who quietly moved money from my savings to cover the shortfall. If I questioned it, my mother would start crying. She always cried just enough to make me feel like the villain. "We need you," she would whisper. "He's going through a hard time. You're the only one we can count on." And just like that, the guilt would wrap around me again. They did not ask me if I was tired. They did not ask me if I could afford it. They did not ask me anything. They just assumed I would step in. And I did, over and over again. Because deep down, I still wanted to be seen. I still wanted to matter. Being needed was the only way I had ever been valued. I watched Kyle sit on the couch playing video games in the middle of the day, surrounded by takeout containers, while I came home exhausted from work, wondering how I was the one being called strong while he lived like a permanent child. My father said, "He just needs more time to figure things out." I had been figuring things out since I was 12. My first big wake-up call came when I tried to buy my first car. I had been saving for years, carefully putting away what I could after covering their bills. I thought I had enough. Then the water heater broke and my father called me late at night saying they could not afford the repair. He did not ask if I could help. He just assumed I would. I drained half my savings to pay for it. I still remember standing at the dealership months later, calculating what I had lost. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that families take care of each other, that one day it would even out. But deep down, I knew. It was never going to even out. They were too comfortable leaning on me, too accustomed to my silence. My parents never said the words out loud, but their actions spoke clearly. Kyle got to live life without consequences. I got to pay for it. When he crashed his car after drinking at a party, they paid for a lawyer. When the insurance premiums spiked, I covered them. when he wanted the latest phone they bought it, and I quietly covered their shortfalls. Every month, the weight got heavier. I stopped buying things for myself. I stopped taking vacations. I told people at work I preferred staying home, but the truth was, I was funding a life that wasn't mine. It was around then that I started noticing how their tone changed depending on money. When I said yes, my mother was warm. Soft, almost loving. When I hesitated, her voice went tight, clipped, distant. My father avoided my calls. Kyle would not speak to me. I learned to associate love with the sound of a bank transfer. That was the financial trap. It wasn't just money. It was control disguised as family loyalty. I wanted to say no, but every no was met with guilt. "You know we can't do this without you," my father said once when I tried to draw a line. And the worst part was he was right. They had built a life around the assumption that I would be their safety net. I was too tired to be proud of what I had achieved because everything I achieved was feeding them. My name wasn't on their house, but my money kept it standing. I remember the night I lay in bed doing the math. In 5 years, I had spent enough to buy a home of my own, but I had nothing to show for it except tired bones and an empty account. They told me I was the responsible one, but in that moment, I saw it for what it was. I was the one holding up a house built on my silence. Kyle was the golden boy who got to live without consequence. I was the scapegoat who paid for the story they told themselves about their family. I didn't know it yet, but that night in the cabin when Kyle held that knife and told me no one would notice if I disappeared, it wasn't just a threat. It was the truth wrapped in steel. I had made myself indispensable and invisible at the same time. That is how traps work. They don't need chains when guilt does the job. The invitation came on a cold November afternoon, the kind of day where the sky looks like a sheet of steel and the air stings your lungs. I was at my desk at work when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Kyle. I stared at his name on the screen for a long time before opening it. He almost never texted unless he needed something. The message was short. We should spend a weekend together at the cabin. Just you and me. Fix things. For a second, I thought it was a joke. Kyle never wanted to fix anything. He just wanted what he wanted. But something in the way he phrased it made me hesitate. Just you and me. I could almost hear his voice saying it. I should have ignored it. I should have known better. But part of me still carried the ridiculous hope that maybe one day he would see me. Maybe one day he would say sorry. That part of me had always been the weakest. I texted back a single word. "When?" He replied within seconds. "Next weekend, Friday to Sunday. It'll be good." I could picture the cabin he was talking about. It belonged to one of my father's old friends, and we used to go there when we were kids. A place tucked away near the White Mountains, surrounded by dense pine forest and snow that came earlier than it did in town. The nearest neighbor was almost half a mile away. No cell signal, just old wooden walls, the smell of pine, and a small stove for heat. The kind of place that swallows sound. A rational voice inside me whispered that this was not a good idea. But another voice, the one that had spent a lifetime craving his approval, whispered back, "Maybe this time will be different." When I told my mother about the invitation, she lit up like it was Christmas. "This is good," she said, her voice warm. "He wants to spend time with you. He's finally growing up." She said it like he was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful. I didn't tell her about the resentment simmering beneath my skin. I didn't tell her about the bills I had paid that month while he spent money on takeout and games. I didn't tell her that part of me wanted to slam the door on him and never look back. I just nodded and let her believe what she wanted to believe. I packed light for the trip. A couple of sweaters, jeans, hiking boots, and my phone. I also slipped a small portable charger into my bag and downloaded a recording app that would automatically activate with a single tap. I didn't know why I did that at the time. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe deep down, I knew who he really was. The drive up the mountain was quiet. Kyle picked me up in his truck on Friday afternoon. The roads were covered in frost, the bare branches of trees bending under the weight of early snow. He kept the music low, humming along to some classic rock station. Every few minutes he would glance at me like he wanted to say something. He didn't. The silence between us felt like it had weight. Heavy. Familiar. About halfway up the mountain, he finally spoke. "It'll be good for us," he said. "You know, to reset." "You're always so tense." He said it like the tension between us was my fault. Like the years of silence, the financial leeching, the way our parents looked through me were all just personality quirks I needed to fix. I stared out the window at the snow-covered forest and said nothing. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun had already started to set. The old building stood quiet and alone, its roof covered in snow smoke from the chimney curling into the gray sky. It was beautiful in that eerie way isolated places often are, the kind of beauty that hides the danger underneath. Inside, everything smelled the same as I remembered. Pine old books and something earthy that clung to the wooden walls. He built a fire while I unpacked my things. The silence stretched. I noticed little things I hadn't before. The door locks looked newer than I remembered. The back door had a heavy latch. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said, "Bears." But there were no bears this close to winter. I brushed it off, but a cold thread of unease slid down my spine. We ate dinner together. He had brought steak and beer, something he called a proper sibling night. He talked more than usual about old stories about how our parents never appreciated him either. I knew he was trying to rewrite history, casting himself as the victim. I didn't bite. I just listened the way I had been trained to. As the night wore on, his words got slower, his laughter louder. The whiskey bottle emptied. His eyes shifted from glassy warmth to something sharper, something that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. He leaned back in the old chair, spinning the camping knife in his hand like it was just another toy. He had brought it out earlier, saying he liked carrying it on trips. I watched the blade catch the light from the fire. It gleamed like a secret waiting to be told. He talked about hiking the next day, about how quiet the woods get in winter. "You could scream and no one would hear," he said with a grin. It was supposed to sound like a joke. It didn't. My hands stayed still on my lap, but my mind raced. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. The world felt far away. Too far. I excused myself to go to bed early. In the small room, I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the door. My hands shook just slightly as I pulled out my phone and turned on the recording app. One tap. No sound. It would run all night. I checked the lock twice. Through the thin walls, I could hear him laughing softly to himself in the living room, the sound of the knife tapping against the table. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It crawled into my bones anyway. I lay down fully dressed, staring at the ceiling while the snow fell outside. This was not a reconciliation. This was something else entirely. I just didn't know how deep it would go yet. But something inside me had already started preparing. I woke up to the sound of the cabin door creaking open. For a second, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too slow, too deliberate. My eyes snapped open, the darkness swallowing the edges of the room. My breath fogged in the cold air. The fire from the living room must have burned down because the temperature had dropped sharply. I stayed still, every muscle tense, my heart already pounding. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, measured. The kind of footsteps that belong to someone who knows exactly where they're going. I pulled myself up without making a sound, bare feet pressing against the cold wood floor. Through the crack beneath the door, a thin line of light spilled in. I caught a shadow moving across it. Kyle. I knew that gait anywhere. A rush of memories hit me all at once. The way he used to slam his locker door at school just to watch me flinch. The way he held power not through what he said, but through what he made me expect. He had never needed to yell. His silence was louder than anyone else's voice. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against the wood. His breathing was steady, calm, too calm for someone drunk and stumbling. Then came the sound I'll never forget, the soft metallic whisper of a knife being unsheathed. I froze. My fingers clenched the door frame. My body knew before my mind did that something terrible was unfolding. I heard him mumble under his breath, words slurred but clear enough to piece together. "Accident in the woods. No one will know. No one cares." The world tilted slightly. My hand went to my jacket pocket on the chair near the door where my phone was hidden. It was already recording. That small action I took before bed now felt like the only thing between me and nothingness. I cracked the door open just enough to see him. He stood near the stove, back turned to me, the camping knife in his hand, catching the faint orange light from the dying fire. The knife didn't shake, neither did his hands. He wasn't drunk enough to stumble. He was focused. The cabin was so quiet I could hear the wind pushing against the walls and the faint sound of snow hitting the roof. It was the kind of silence that eats your voice if you scream. I watched him pace slowly, talking to himself, like he had practiced the story in his head 100 times. She went for a walk. Stupid. Slipped on the ice. He chuckled softly to himself. My skin prickled. I had heard many versions of his cruelty over the years, but never like this. This wasn't just manipulation. This was planning. The back door latch was locked. He had made sure of that earlier. I didn't have a clear way out without making noise. My brain ran through everything like a checklist. No cell signal. One road in and out. Snow piling up outside. No neighbors nearby. And a brother who thought no one would care if I disappeared. I pulled the door open another inch. It creaked softly and his head turned slightly. I froze. For a long, suspended second, he stared at the hallway. Then he smiled. Not the kind of smile you give someone you love. The kind that belongs to someone who believes they have already won. "You awake," he said softly. His voice was slow, low, soaked in something colder than alcohol. I didn't answer. I stepped back quietly, letting the door fall shut again. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. He walked down the hallway. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Step, step, step. I grabbed my jacket and slipped it on, keeping the phone in my pocket. If he opened the door, the recording would catch everything. That was the only thought that kept me steady. He stopped right outside my room. I heard the blade tap the wood near the handle. Once. Twice. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just let that sound fill the air like a warning. My breath stayed trapped in my throat. Then his whisper slipped through the crack in the door. "Even if you scream, who would care?" The words sank into me like ice water. I had spent years proving him wrong without ever saying it out loud. But here, in the middle of nowhere, I had nothing left to prove. I had only one thing I could control. I waited until I heard him move away back toward the living room, the sound of the chair scraping the floor. A sigh, then silence again. But I didn't relax. Not even a little. I cracked the window open just enough to test it. It stuck at first, but then gave way with a soft pop. Cold air rushed in, cutting through my skin. Outside, snow kept falling, layering thick on the ground. It wouldn't be an easy escape, but it was a way out. I moved slowly, pulling my boots toward me. Every sound felt like a thunderclap in the quiet. He mumbled something from the other room. His words were slurred again, but this time I caught a few of them. "She won't even fight back. Nobody would." My blood ran colder. That wasn't drunk talk. That was certainty. I slipped my boots on, tied them as quietly as I could, and pushed the window open wide enough for my body to fit through. My hands burned from the cold metal. I climbed out, moving slow, careful not to make the old wood creak. The snow crunched beneath my feet. My breath fogged in front of me. I could see the truck parked near the tree line. I had left my keys in my jacket pocket when we arrived. I crouched low, keeping to the shadows, listening. Inside the cabin, the chair creaked again. A bottle clinked against the table. His laugh was low and mean. It followed me out the window like a ghost. I crept toward the truck. Every step was deliberate, every sound measured. The snow was deep enough to swallow the sound of my boots. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the door. I slid inside and shut it slowly, barely letting the latch click. The air in the truck was freezing. My breath came in small, fast bursts. My heart wouldn't slow down. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught. A small miracle. Headlights off. I backed down the snowy road with nothing but moonlight and instinct. The cabin grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but his words didn't. "Even if you scream, who would care?" I gripped the wheel tighter and kept driving until the road met the main highway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My phone was still recording the only proof I had. My body shook, but not from the cold. I had left the cabin, but the night was far from over. The sky was still dark when I reached the main highway, the truck sliding slightly on the frozen pavement, as if the road itself wanted to keep me trapped in the night. My hands were locked on the steering wheel so tight that the skin over my knuckles burned. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't look at my phone. I just drove. The headlights carved through the fog like two weak flashlights, but it was enough. I didn't care where I ended up as long as it wasn't that cabin. For the first 20 miles, I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see the shape of his truck behind me, headlights cutting through the snow. But the road was empty. Just me, the storm, and the memory of the knife gleaming in his hand. I drove until the fuel gauge dipped dangerously low and the sun started to stretch pale fingers across the horizon. Vermont mornings have a way of looking beautiful even when they're brutal. The light bled over the mountains like a secret I wasn't supposed to witness. I pulled into a small gas station outside of town. No one ever talks about one of those places where the pumps are old, the sign flickers, and the attendant doesn't ask questions. I left the engine running while I filled up my eyes, flicking toward every passing car. My pulse didn't slow down. It wouldn't for a long time. I knew what I had to do. I had planned it in fragments for years, even when I didn't realize it. Leaving wasn't about running away. It was about finally stopping the quiet bleeding I had lived with my entire life. I got back in the truck and opened my phone. I didn't make calls. I didn't text. I uploaded the recording to 2 encrypted cloud backups and sent it to an attorney's email address. A month earlier, when I'd finally begun to question how much more of this life I could stand, I'd met with a lawyer about separating my finances from my family. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't even told myself why. Now I knew. This wasn't just paranoia. It was preparation. The email was short. If anything happens to me, start with this. I hit send. I opened my banking apps next. Years of transfers, payments, and quiet sacrifices stared back at me. I closed my eyes for a moment, then started cutting. I moved everything out of joint accounts and automatic transfers. Mortgage support gone. Insurance payments gone. Utility coverage gone. I severed every line they'd tied to me like invisible ropes. With each confirmation notification, I felt a small weight lift off my chest. It didn't erase the fear, but it made the fear mine, not theirs. I drove straight to Burlington and parked near a small cafe that opened early. I went inside, ordered coffee, and sat in the corner where no one would look twice at me. My phone kept buzzing with system alerts. Scheduled payment canceled. Transfer failed. Automatic withdrawal stopped. They would wake up soon and realize their world was unraveling. For once, it wouldn't be my problem. I took a sip of the bitter coffee and felt it burn down my throat. It tasted like something close to freedom. Not clean, not pretty, but real. From there, everything moved quickly. I met my lawyer at their office as soon as they opened. I handed over a written statement and copies of the audio file. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. My voice stayed steady even though my insides still felt like glass rattling in a storm. The lawyer's face grew cold and serious as they listened to the recording. When Kyle's voice came through thick and slurred, but clear enough to understand, I saw something shift in their expression. They didn't have to tell me this was serious. I already knew. We put everything into a secure file. I signed papers I had been too afraid to sign before. Power of attorney instructions, financial withdrawal statements, emergency contacts, protective filings. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. If Kyle or my parents tried to paint me as unstable, they would be facing evidence. My evidence. By noon, I had transferred the lease of my small apartment into my name alone, cut every shared utility, and closed the credit cards that my parents had quietly attached themselves to years ago. It was astonishing how fast the world changes when you stop asking for permission. I didn't tell anyone where I was going next. I rented a small apartment under a new lease using my savings, a place tucked away on a quiet street in Burlington where no one would think to look. I carried only what I needed: clothes, documents, laptop, nothing sentimental. The rest I left behind like a skin I'd finally decided to shed. I got a new phone number. No social media. No forwarding address. My name vanished from anything they could track in a single afternoon. As I lay on the floor of my empty apartment that night, wrapped in a blanket I bought at a thrift store, I felt something strange. Not joy, not peace, just the absence of weight. For the first time, their needs weren't wrapped around my throat like a leash. I listened to the radiator hum softly in the corner. The outside world was quiet snow piling up on the street like a soft blanket that made everything disappear. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was distance. I knew Kyle would eventually realize I was gone. I knew he would tell my parents a story about how ungrateful I was, how I abandoned them. Maybe he would even try to twist that night in the cabin into something else. But I didn't care. I had proof. More importantly, I had no strings left for them to pull. I sat up staring at the blank white wall of my new apartment and whispered out loud, "You don't get to touch me anymore." It didn't sound dramatic. It sounded quiet, like a lock clicking shut from the inside. Over the next few days, I set everything in motion. I updated my work address, changed my direct deposit, and asked for personal mail to be held at a secure location. I opened a P.O. box. Every step was deliberate. Every action cut a thread they had tied to me. It wasn't enough to run. I needed to disappear in a way that made it impossible for them to find me without going through legal channels. I wasn't going to be their shadow anymore. I wasn't going to be the scapegoat that kept their house warm while they bled me dry. When I finally lay back on the floor that night, exhaustion wrapped around me like a heavy coat, but it was my exhaustion. My life. My silence. For the first time in years, I didn't have to brace myself for the next demand, the next manipulation, the next guilt trip. I didn't have to flinch when the phone buzzed. I didn't have to rehearse apologies for things I didn't do. I had built a wall between us. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Somewhere out there, Kyle was probably waking up hungover, confused, and alone. Somewhere out there, my parents were realizing the bills wouldn't pay themselves. And somewhere deep inside me, a part of myself I thought was dead was finally starting to breathe. The first morning in the new apartment felt like waking up in someone else's life. The radiator hissed in the corner. The light slipped through the thin curtains, and for the first time in years, there was no sound of another person's footsteps. No kitchen arguments, no phone buzzing with their demands. Just silence. It was strange at first, almost too loud. I sat up slowly, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, and listened to the quiet like it was a language I hadn't spoken in years. My phone was still on the nightstand, the same one that had carried every call for money, every guilt trip, every manipulation disguised as family conversation. Now, it was still. No new messages. No calls. I had expected to feel terror, maybe guilt. But what crept in was something softer, something fragile and unfamiliar. Relief. I spent the first day walking through the apartment as if memorizing my own freedom. Every corner was mine. Every decision was mine. If I wanted to sit in the dark, I could. If I wanted to play music, I could. If I wanted to turn the phone off and vanish into quiet, I could. I didn't owe anyone explanations. By the second day, the silence began to stretch and twist, revealing how deeply I had been trained to anticipate their voices. I kept waiting for the inevitable flood of calls and messages. But what arrived first was exactly what I should have expected. A single text from my mother. "Netflix isn't working. Did you forget to pay?" That was it. Not. "Are you okay?" Not. "Where are you?" Not even. "We're worried." Just a practical question wrapped in entitlement. A reminder of the only role I had ever been allowed to play. I stared at the message for a long time, watching the little bubbles at the bottom that never appeared. They didn't care about where I was. They cared about what I provided. I put the phone face down and left it on the counter. I didn't respond. That silence was mine now, too. By the third day, the texts started to build. My father tried next. "You need to call us. This is serious." Then a second message an hour later. "You're being dramatic." Then, late at night, "Kyle is worried." That last one almost made me laugh. Kyle worried about me. No. He was worried about the structure crumbling without me. He was worried about losing the foundation I had built for them to stand on while they never noticed me beneath their feet. I let the messages pile up, each one like a weak echo from a world I had already walked away from. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't delete the texts. I just didn't answer. The fourth day was harder. The quiet didn't just sit in the room anymore. It climbed into my chest. Years of being needed had left scars I didn't even recognize as wounds. For so long, I had been the one who fixed everything, paid everything, explained everything. Without those demands, I wasn't sure what shape my life would take. I sat on the floor with a cup of coffee, staring at my reflection in the dark liquid, realizing I didn't actually know what I liked. So much of my existence had been shaped by reacting to them. Now there was nothing to react to. That emptiness felt like both freedom and an open wound. On the fifth day, the silence was broken not by a call, but by a knock on the door. I froze instantly. My name wasn't on anything connected to them anymore. They didn't know my address. Still, my heart raced as I walked toward the door. Through the peephole, I saw only a delivery driver holding a small package. My lawyer had sent over official copies of the financial separation documents, legal proof that they no longer had any claim over my income or assets. I signed for it with shaking hands. When the door clicked shut behind me, I leaned against it and felt my body sag with a mixture of exhaustion and power. They couldn't reach me anymore. They could try to call. They could try to guilt me. They could even try to lie. But they couldn't touch me. Day 6 brought something I hadn't expected. I laughed. It happened suddenly out of nowhere. I had made eggs in the morning, opened the window to let the cold air in, and stood there watching the snow fall. It was so absurdly ordinary, so quiet, so mine. And I laughed because for years I thought leaving them would be impossible. I thought their voices would follow me forever. But the world outside them didn't collapse. It didn't even blink. The air tasted the same. The snow fell the same. Life went on without their hands around my throat. Their control had only ever existed because I let them hold the rope. By the 7th day, their silence became louder than mine. My phone was filled with messages. My mother had shifted from confusion to anger. "How could you do this to us? You're abandoning your family." My father had gone from angry to desperate. "We're losing everything. Mortgage is late. Insurance too. Call us." And then, finally, Kyle. "You think you're better than us? You're nothing without us." The message didn't sting like it used to. It rolled off me like rain on glass. He was unraveling and he wanted me to be the net that caught him, but I wasn't his net anymore. I wasn't anyone's net. I stared at that message until the battery warning flashed, then turned off the phone completely. No explanations, no arguments, just silence. It was the first time in my life I let their panic burn out on its own. In those 7 days, I learned something I should have known all along. They didn't love me the way I loved them. They loved the version of me that paid their bills, held their weight, and stayed quiet when they hurt me. They loved the ghost they built from my labor, not the person standing behind it. When the ghost disappeared, they panicked. But no one came looking for me. Not really. They didn't file a missing persons report. They didn't go to the police. They didn't drive through the streets searching. They just kept asking who was going to clean up the mess. And that told me everything. It confirmed what Kyle had said in the cabin. No one would notice. He had been right about them, but he had been wrong about me. I noticed. I mattered, and I wasn't invisible anymore. On the night of the 7th day, I lay in bed and listened to the quiet once more. It wasn't empty this time. It was steady. A foundation instead of a void. I whispered into the darkness. This is mine now, and for the first time in my life, I believed it. The first real sign that their world was falling apart didn't come from a phone call or a text message. It came from an email from the bank. Because my name was listed as a secondary on a few shared accounts, I still got automated notices. The subject line read, "Mortgage Delinquency Warning." I stared at it for a long time, letting the weight of it settle into me. This was what happened when the financial backbone of their house walked away. They had spent years treating me like a safety net that would never break. Now the ground was rushing up to meet them. The house that my parents loved to brag about at holiday dinners had a mortgage payment due, and without my deposits quietly keeping it afloat, they had nothing. It had only been 2 weeks since I walked out of that cabin, and already their carefully maintained facade was cracking. I closed the email without answering. It wasn't mine to fix anymore. Over the next few days, the texts from my mother began to sound different. Less entitled, more frantic. "We're behind on bills. Can you just help us?" This one time became, "They're threatening to shut off the heat." Then, "They're talking about foreclosure." The irony didn't escape me. Vermont winters don't forgive unpaid heating bills. For years, I had been the one making sure the pipes didn't freeze, the lights didn't flicker, the mortgage didn't default. They never thanked me. They barely noticed. But now my absence was everywhere in their house. It was in the cold creeping through the walls in the empty mailbox where bills piled up in the empty bank account they had drained without ever calling it dependence. Kyle tried to play it differently. His first text was angry like a child slamming a door. "You're really just going to let them drown. You're disgusting." A few days later, the tone shifted. "Look, I didn't mean what I said. We can work something out." He needed me. That was the part he could never say out loud. Without me, he didn't have his soft landing anymore. I didn't respond to him either. I wasn't interested in negotiating with someone who held a knife to me and whispered about how no one would care if I disappeared. By the third week, the bank had escalated. A foreclosure notice. My mother left me a voicemail that night, her voice breaking halfway through. "I don't understand why you're doing this to us. We're family. Families help each other." Her words twisted in the air like they always had, but this time they didn't land. I wasn't doing this to them. I had just stopped saving them from the consequences of their choices. That's the thing about enablers. When you stop enabling, they call it betrayal. My father held out longer. His texts were short and clipped. "We can fix this." Then, "Call me." Then, silence. He had always been the quiet one, the one who pretended to stand above the manipulation while benefiting from every check I signed. When I didn't answer, his pride cracked too. "I never thought you'd turn your back on your own family." That line might have broken me once. It might have sent me back running to pay their bills and accept their half-hearted love. But now it just felt like what it was. A line from a script they'd all been reading my entire life. Kyle's unraveling was faster. His friends had grown used to the easy money, the parties, the trips, the new phone every year. When that dried up, so did they. He called me at 3 a.m. one night. I didn't answer, but I saved the voicemail. His voice was slurred with anger. "You think you're so much better than us. You're nothing without me. Without them. You'll come crawling back." I listened to that message twice and then deleted it. It wasn't a threat I feared anymore. It was a confession. His world was crumbling and he didn't know how to exist without mine propping it up. The family's slow collapse became public faster than I expected. It was a small town. People noticed things. The power company shutting off the lights. The foreclosure notice taped to the door. The sheriff's visits. The whispers in the grocery store lines. My parents had spent years cultivating an image of stability, of being the family that had it all together. Now that image was peeling away like cheap paint. I got a text from an old neighbor. "Everything okay over there? Saw the notice on your folks' place." I typed out a response and deleted it. I didn't owe anyone explanations. I owed myself silence. When you spend your whole life being invisible except for the things you give, people don't quite know how to react when you finally stop giving. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't celebrating their ruin. But I wasn't going to save them either. They had built a castle on sand, and I had been the tide they pretended didn't exist. Now the water was pulling back. On the 5th week, they tried to guilt me one last time. A group call request popped up. I let it ring. I didn't need to hear what I already knew they'd say. Kyle would cry or shout, my mother would plead. My father would try to sound rational. But beneath it all, the message would be the same: come back and fix this. The answer was still no. Their unraveling wasn't just financial, it was personal. Without someone to play the scapegoat, their family dynamic had nothing to anchor it. For years, Kyle had been the golden boy because I was the one who absorbed the blame and the responsibility. Without me, the balance broke. They started turning on each other. My mother blamed my father for not saving more. My father blamed Kyle for wasting everything. Kyle blamed everyone. I didn't have to be in the house to hear the cracks. I could read them in every text, every voicemail, every silence. One night I walked through Burlington's quiet streets as snow fell softly on the pavement, and I realized something extraordinary. Their world could burn, and mine didn't have to. I wasn't bound to their disaster anymore. The house would probably go to auction, the utilities would be cut off, they would face the same real-world consequences that other people face when they don't take responsibility. And maybe, just maybe, they would finally understand what it had cost me to keep them afloat all those years. But whether they understood or not didn't matter. Their survival was not my duty. Their unraveling was not my guilt to carry. I had spent a lifetime being the quiet storm holding their fragile structure together. Now I was the still air on the other side of the wreckage. My phone buzzed again as I walked home. I didn't even look at it this time. The silence I had built wasn't just about them not reaching me. It was about me not reaching back. I went home, made tea, and sat by the window. Across the street, lights twinkled in someone else's apartment. Life moved forward. And for the first time, I let it. Their world could come apart as much as it needed to. Mine was just beginning to settle. Kyle's downfall didn't come like an explosion. It came like rot spreading through wood, silent at first, then undeniable. It began with the recording, the one from that night in the cabin, the one I had quietly stored in 2 separate places and handed to my lawyer the morning after I escaped. For weeks, it just sat there, a piece of evidence waiting in the dark. But rot doesn't stay hidden forever. It surfaces. It cracks through the paint. The moment came on a gray February afternoon when my lawyer called. The audio has been forwarded to the local authorities, they said. There's enough there to open an investigation. I sat at my small kitchen table, the radiator hissing my hands steady for the first time in weeks. I didn't ask how. I didn't need to. I had always known the day would come when his cruelty would no longer be a private wound. It would become public. The police called me the next morning. A detective with a calm voice asked me to verify the details of the night. I told them everything. I didn't need to embellish. His own voice had already done the work for me. Even if you scream, who would care? That sentence alone carried weight. Threatening someone with harm, even when slurred, isn't something the law ignores easily, not when it's recorded clearly and time-stamped. I gave them the location of the cabin. They found his fingerprints on the knife he'd left behind in his drunken haze. The pieces of the story fit together too well. When the detectives contacted Kyle, his arrogance cracked faster than I expected. He'd built his whole identity on control, on the assumption that I'd always stay quiet. But silence wasn't protecting him anymore. The first thing he did was call me. I didn't answer. Then came a string of texts. "We can fix this. You don't have to do this. If you say it was a misunderstanding, they'll drop it." I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't owe him a lifeline. I had spent years holding him up while he sharpened the knife against me. He could fall on his own now. Word spread quickly through town. Not because I told anyone, but because he did. He tried to control the story. He always had. But this time he wasn't in control. He told his friends I was lying, that it was some kind of revenge plot. But the recording spoke louder than his charm ever could. People heard his words. They heard the cold certainty in them. And the small cracks in his golden boy mask widened until they split open completely. His friends started distancing themselves. One by one, they stopped answering his calls, stopped covering for him, stopped showing up to the little pity parties he threw to paint himself as a victim. He wasn't the charismatic golden boy anymore. He was the guy who threatened his sister with a knife in a cabin, a predator hiding behind a familiar smile. The investigation wasn't fast, but it was steady. They questioned him, questioned me, questioned the property owner. Every step tightened the walls around him a little more. My parents tried to intervene, of course. My mother left me voicemails sobbing, saying, "He's your brother. You can't let them destroy his life over a mistake." But it wasn't a mistake. It had been a choice. A deliberate, whispered choice in the middle of the night. My father tried the practical approach. If you just tell them he was drunk and didn't mean it, this will go away. Families don't turn on each other. The irony burned. They had turned on me my whole life without ever admitting it. Now that the consequences were at their door, suddenly family meant loyalty. But loyalty had never gone both ways in that house. For weeks, Kyle clung to the story that it was all just words. Nothing happened, no one was hurt. But threats leave marks even when they don't draw blood. And this time, the law listened. The case moved to a formal hearing. The day Kyle walked into the courthouse, he didn't look like the boy who always got away with everything. He looked smaller. Not because of the suit he wore, not because of the gray winter light spilling through the windows, but because the world around him wasn't bending anymore. For once, it wasn't me standing on trial. It was him. I didn't testify that day. The audio was enough. His own voice betrayed him. The prosecutor laid out the facts with surgical precision. The threats, the timing, the isolation of the cabin, the fact that he had locked the doors. It painted a picture he couldn't explain away with his usual smirk. My parents sat in the back row. My mother's face was pale and tight. My father's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle twitch from across the room. They weren't angry at him. They were angry at me for not saving him, for refusing to play the scapegoat one more time. Their golden boy was crumbling in public and there was no one left to prop him up. I watched as the judge denied the initial motion to dismiss the case. It wasn't over, but it was real. A restraining order followed. He wasn't allowed to contact me. No calls, no texts, nothing. For the first time in my life, there was a legal wall between us. Kyle's friends stopped coming to his house. The bills kept piling up. The foreclosure loomed larger. My parents, who had once defended his every misstep, now had no one left to blame but him. The tension inside their collapsing home was a quiet, desperate thing. I saw it in the brief glimpses I allowed myself through secondhand whispers from people in town. My mother was crying in the grocery store parking lot. My father was drinking alone at the bar. Kyle was isolated, and I was free. The night the restraining order went into effect, I stood in my apartment with the window open, the cold air biting at my skin, and let the reality wash over me. He couldn't reach me anymore. Not legally, not emotionally, not financially. He had spent his whole life believing I was beneath him, believing I would always clean up his mess. Now he was sinking into the mess he had made, and I was watching from the shore with no intention of throwing a rope. That was the moment I understood that justice doesn't always look like vengeance. Sometimes justice is just refusing to carry someone else's sins anymore. The fall wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was slow, methodical, inevitable. One court date led to another. His reputation unraveled like an old sweater. The people who used to laugh at his jokes crossed the street to avoid him. The parents who used to worship him stopped answering their phone when the debt collectors called. The boy who once stood at the center of every room now sat in the corner ignored. He had said no one would care if I disappeared. He was wrong. I cared. I chose myself. And that choice was the beginning of the end for him. The day I realized my life no longer revolved around them was quiet. No dramatic music, no fireworks, just the sound of my boots crunching against fresh snow on a Burlington sidewalk. I was on my way to work, scarf wrapped around my neck, the cold sharp against my cheeks, and for the first time in years, I wasn't hurrying toward a crisis. I wasn't calculating how much of my paycheck would disappear into someone else's mess. I wasn't bracing for another guilt-soaked voicemail. I was simply walking. And it hit me like sunlight after a storm. This life was mine now. Not borrowed. Not taken. Mine. In the weeks after Kyle's restraining order and my parents' house unraveling, something shifted inside me. The constant hum of anxiety that had lived in my body since childhood began to fade, replaced by a steadier rhythm I didn't quite recognize at first. It was the sound of freedom. Not the loud cinematic kind, but the kind that settles quietly in your chest and builds roots. I started small. A plant on the kitchen counter, a bookshelf I assembled myself. I cooked dinner in silence without anyone complaining about what I made or how much I spent. I learned to wake up early, just to sit with a cup of coffee and the sound of nothing. Silence, which once felt like a void, had become something warm, something alive. I didn't rush to fill it with apologies or explanations. I let it breathe. The first real change came at work. I had always been good at my job, but never bold. Years of being dismissed at home had taught me to shrink even when I was capable. One morning, I walked into a meeting, listened to a colleague speak over me, and for the first time, I didn't go quiet. I raised my voice. Clear, unshaking. People turned to listen, and when I finished, they nodded. It sounds small, but to me it was seismic. I wasn't the invisible one anymore. I had spent years being the background character in someone else's story. Now I was writing my own. I stopped sending money to my parents. I stopped answering calls that carried guilt instead of love. My therapist once told me that reclaiming a life doesn't always mean grand gestures. Sometimes it's just choosing yourself 100 small times in a row. So I did. I signed up for a ceramics class at the community center. I started hiking on weekends, not because anyone wanted me to, but because I loved the feeling of standing on a ridge with nothing but the wind and the trees. I bought a pair of boots just for myself. Real leather. Expensive. A gift I would have once called irresponsible. Now it felt like a declaration. My apartment became a home slowly, piece by piece. A second-hand rug, a thrifted armchair, fairy lights along the window. None of it matched, but all of it was mine. I didn't decorate it for anyone else. I didn't clean it for anyone else. I didn't apologize for the things I liked. In the past, everything I owned had felt temporary, ready to be sacrificed if the family needed me again. Now, nothing in that space was built to be given away. My name was on the lease. My name was on the bills. My name was on my future. The winter turned to early spring. Kyle's case moved forward in slow, steady steps. My lawyer kept me updated, but it no longer consumed my mind. His fall was his. My life was mine. I stopped checking my phone obsessively. I stopped waiting for the next disaster. My body started to feel lighter, my steps less cautious. It was like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel and realizing the sun had been waiting the whole time. My parents' voices faded too. The calls became less frequent, the texts less sharp. They were too busy dealing with their own consequences. And for once, I didn't feel responsible for their pain. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. I wasn't their keeper. I never had been. I was just the only one who kept playing the part. One afternoon, I received a letter from the bank confirming the foreclosure on their house. I read it slowly, the same way I used to read their bills before I paid them, except this time the numbers weren't mine to fix. I folded the letter and slid it into a drawer. No tears, no guilt. Just the quiet understanding that their castle had been built on my back, and without me, it crumbled. That wasn't my failure. That was their reality. Around that time, I started making plans I had never allowed myself to dream of before. Travel, grad school, maybe a small business one day. They were fragile ideas at first, delicate like snowflakes. But each time I said yes to myself, they solidified a little more. I opened a savings account with my name and my name alone. I started putting away money for things that mattered to me. Not for emergency bailouts, not for guilt payments, not for someone else's stability. For me. There were nights when I still woke up from dreams of the cabin. The cold, the knife. His whisper. Trauma doesn't leave just because your abuser falls. But even in those moments, I'd sit up, look around at the walls. I chose the life I built, and remember, he can't reach me anymore. Not legally, not financially, not emotionally. The power he held had been an illusion. I was the one who made it real. I was also the one who took it back. On a Saturday in late April, I stood on a hiking trail overlooking the mountains, the same mountains where the cabin sat miles away. The air was cool and clean, the sky an endless stretch of blue. I breathed deeply, letting the air fill my lungs without the weight of anyone else's expectations pressing against my ribs. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my mother. "We miss you. Things aren't the same without you." I stared at it for a moment, not with anger or guilt, but with a strange calm. I didn't reply. I turned my phone off and slipped it back into my jacket. The world didn't end. The wind still blew through the trees. The sky stayed blue. That was the thing they never understood. Their world had revolved around me because I allowed it to, but mine didn't need them to exist. Reclamation isn't loud. It's quiet mornings with coffee. It's late hikes on a sunny trail. It's buying your own boots. It's saying no without explaining why. It's sitting in the silence they used to fill with guilt and realizing it's yours now. Mine. All mine. 1 year after the night in the cabin, I stood at the edge of the lake outside Burlington and watched the last snow of winter melt into still water. The air was crisp and clean, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but full. I closed my eyes and listened to it. No footsteps behind me. No knife glinting in the dark. No voice whispering that I didn't matter. Just silence. My silence. The kind I built for myself. The kind I had spent my whole life believing I didn't deserve. The world didn't end when I walked away. Their house fell. Their lies cracked. Their golden boy shattered. But me, I finally stood on solid ground. For years, I had believed their version of me. The quiet one. The reliable one. The invisible one. But they never saw that the only reason their world kept spinning was because I held it up with my hands. When I finally let go, they called it betrayal. But it was never betrayal. It was freedom. The knife in the cabin wasn't the first cut. It was just the last one I was willing to take. The bruise he left wasn't on my skin. It was on my soul, buried under years of being erased. And the day I climbed out that window wasn't just an escape. It was the moment I stepped back into my own life. Kyle lives somewhere else now. I don't care where. The restraining order is still in effect, and that's all that matters. My parents' house was sold at auction months ago. They live smaller now, quieter. Sometimes I get texts, sometimes I don't. But none of that changes the fact that I stopped being their scapegoat. I stopped being the background character in their story. I stopped giving them the pieces of me they never earned. I don't hate them. Hate takes too much space. I've learned to live with something colder and cleaner. Indifference. Their approval doesn't build me. Their silence doesn't break me. Their love, conditional and heavy, doesn't define me. I wake up in the mornings and drink coffee at my kitchen table with the window cracked open. I hear the city waking up. People laugh. Cars pass. Life moves forward. And so do I. Every scar, every cold night, every tear that dried before anyone saw it led me here. Not to revenge. Not to a spotlight. To peace. A quiet kind of peace that feels like breathing after being underwater for too long. Sometimes I walk past the trail that leads toward the mountain. I never go back to the cabin. I don't need to. The cabin isn't a place anymore. It's a line in the story. The night everything shifted. The night I stopped begging to be seen and started seeing myself. The night I stopped being their safety net and became my own anchor. I'm not the girl who stood frozen in that hallway anymore. I'm the woman who walked away and never looked back. They told me no one would notice if I disappeared. But they were wrong. I noticed. I was never invisible. I was just standing in the wrong light. And now the world feels wide and open and mine. The silence that used to crush me now holds me up. It's no longer their silence. It's mine. And I will never give it back. People say silence is empty, but they're wrong. Silence speaks. It tells the truth about who stands beside you when everything falls apart. For years, I believed I was invisible, that my pain was something meant to be swallowed so others could stay comfortable. But that night in the cabin proved something I will never forget. The moment I stopped begging to be seen was the moment I became impossible to ignore. I know some of you watching this have lived through your own kind of cabin. Maybe it wasn't a knife. Maybe it wasn't a brother. But maybe it was a family who made you feel small, or a friend who used you until there was nothing left to give. Maybe it was years of being the one who carried the weight while everyone else looked away. I want to say this clearly to anyone who knows that feeling your silence is not weakness. It's survival. And the day you decide to use that silence to build a life that belongs to you, that's the day everything changes. The world won't collapse if you walk away from people who refuse to see you. Their world might, but yours will finally begin. So tell me, what would you do if the people closest to you whispered that no one would notice if you disappeared? Would you keep standing in their shadow, or would you choose yourself? If this story reached you, if it stirred something inside you, then speak up in the comments. Your words might be the light someone else needs tonight. Let's talk about the moment you realized your worth was bigger than someone else's control. And if this story made you feel something anger, fire, courage, don't just scroll away. Share it. Someone out there might need to hear this. Because the truth is, there's a version of you that exists outside the silence. And they are waiting for you to step into your own light. This is my story, but it could be anyone's.